see. Lawyers have a really hard time with 5 to 7 minute presentations, and it would only be hindered by my use of slides, so I thought I would, as the lawyer, skip the slides and try to be brief, but it will be hard. I wanted to start by just putting up as a little vignette, so this community in search, and if we think about being social in an online community, there's some real distinct differences. One, we have this permanent member. One permanent member, and they're invisible. They're non-contributing generally. They provide the framework, but very little of the content. They're all seeing. They're very active, but it tends to be outside the view of all the people who actually think they're part of the community. They're behind the scenes. And this member is a machine, and they're very busy doing information extraction. And because they're a machine and not a person, or they're a machine with a higher amount of processing power probably than the average person, they're able to do different things well than all the other people who are participating in the group. Some of these things are, they have this completely time-unbounded memory, right? I live in a community, and we have 3 people on the block who've been there forever. They're all 3 of them are really old, Mr. Wong, Grandma Fuji, as she's known in my house, and Mrs. Edwards. And they've been there for a really long time, but all their memories are really lousy at this point, right? And they can't actually tell us a whole lot about what's happened in the community over the time. They can tell us the highlights, they can tell us the generals, but they can't tell me specifically what the Cresses, who lived in my house for 55 years, did. And all of a sudden, when we bring our life into these online communities, we have this new entity that's participating in the community in this very unobtrusive way, that has this enormous memory and enormous ability to process, mine, extract data, and I would say more importantly, extract different kinds of knowledge. And many of these issues present on the back end lots of privacy issues, which is the primary issue I'm going to talk about today, although I think that there are lots of legal and policy issues in search generally, IP being another one, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. So privacy issues have already been huge in your community. We have the disclosure of AOL of search terms, which I think they probably thought they had de-identified enough, and clearly K-anonymity would have been a good concept. The Google, Microsoft, AOL pressure from the Department of Justice to turn over search terms, right, which people thought were going to be really useful in helping them identify different ways to deal with child pornography in particular. But in a slightly grander context, all the pressure that's been brought to bear, as we know, in the telecommunications companies that have turned over gobs of data, transactional data about their communities, right, patterns and associations of communications, which has caused lots of furor and lawsuits and other things. So the Patriot Act, data mining, the Hepting v. AT&T case, I think all give us a sense of what happens as we begin to have lots of data about lots of people's, not just what they're saying or what they're searching for, but who they associate with, what information they're providing, and their patterns of behavior and activity over periods of time, because we think that we're going to be able to generate different kinds of knowledge, and not all of it is knowledge that we're going to use for commerce. There's different people who think they're going to be able to leverage this knowledge in different ways. There's also, I think, a lurking issue about this knowledge that is being generated within different corporations, creating different kinds of obligations to act. Right? At what point should you be able to predict certain kinds of behaviors that other people might want warning of? And we're developing these really rich abilities to extract knowledge from these information sets. And at what point do we have knowledge that we should act upon? This is already a big issue in kind of the intellectual property, contributory, secondary liability side, right? So to what extent do you have an obligation to design technology in a way that is going to impede people who are doing illegal activities in the future? And here we're developing technology that engages in this very massive data searching and information extraction through which we can produce knowledge. Well, what kinds of knowledge can we produce, and who might want us to act upon different knowledge sets that we might have? So what are some of the ways in which I think search are going to be changing, all of which I think are going to raise even greater privacy issues? So one, what will we be searching? We've already seen brought up in other people's presentations, I was happy to see, where people are, right? Presence is one of the things that we're going to be searching. People care a lot about other people knowing where they are. Women tend to care more. What people are. we're going to be seeing more and more data being searched that is about us as individuals, whether it's our DNA profiles or other things that are extracted from us, what people are doing, who people are associating with, and I think importantly, information about the environment around people, the sensor network data that we're going to be seeing collected, whether it's technology that we're using that is going to disclose things like presence, or things that are truly sensed. Many of those things, despite the fact that they may not be about people, will certainly reveal lots of things about the populations in the environments that we are sensing. And through this, what we're going to hopefully be able to do is gain knowledge and, of course, engage in predictions. And some of those predictions, because we're not the only people who are going to be able to make predictions based on the data, are going to have unintended consequences. And it's because search engines in many ways are, and particularly the social networking sites, are in many ways both participants but also intermediaries in creating these. Often it's very difficult to predict what people are going to do in these communities and therefore what we're going to learn about them. And sometimes we find out that we've learned something that we're really not so sure we should know. And many of this happens because I think people both don't understand the benefits and they don't understand the risks of the disclosure of information, and they particularly don't understand it when they're not actively disclosing information. So they're not making a decision to turn over their driver's license to somebody. They're just undertaking a host of activities, a set of activities in an environment through which they're hoping to get information back. They're not actually thinking about the fact that they're disclosing, right? They're asking for stuff, but in the act of asking, they're disclosing, and I think it makes it an even more difficult cognitive jump for people to understand that all those little bits of questions are actually very revealing about them. Some of the benefits that I think people don't understand, I want to use an example. Many years ago, I spent a lot of time looking at health information privacy, and I was astounded to find at the time there was a survey that had gone out that had asked people the extent to which they were comfortable disclosing de-identified data for health research. Something like 85% of the population said, no way. Now, I found that shocking, right? But I do think when we look at sensitive information, even though there's a lot for the community to benefit from, people are incredibly sensitive about the privacy issues, and I think in many ways have a deep distrust of the ability to de-identify. And I think in some ways, given the fact that people don't know what other people know, right? We can use the known unknowns concept, which is really popular these days, makes people very uncomfortable that anybody else is actually going to be able to predict whether or not the data that's being disclosed is at some later date going to come up and bite them on the butt. I also think that people don't understand the risks, and I think most people wouldn't have been able to understand that their AOL search queries, if they were disclosed without identifiers that tied them to that data in any explicit way, that people would be able to basically put the pieces together and come back and call them up on the phone in the middle of America and say, hey, we're going to use you on the front page of the New York Times. And so people are having a really difficult time both evaluating risks and benefits in this environment, and I think it's going to continue to get far more difficult. So there are some serious issues about explaining to people, figuring out interfaces that let people better understand the bounds of community, right? Typically when I think about a community, it both has, I'm in a community for some set period of time, that community contains some specific people, and I'm engaged in certain activities, and there's the, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, and I think many of the individuals who are using social networks today, particularly the populations on the college campus, don't really understand that there's no Vegas there. Right? What they're doing is actually everywhere. And most recently, there was a student who actually just had a law firm job offer rescinded for some of their behavior on a, kind of social networking kind of site. So the last concept I wanted to put out there is this understanding of social forgiveness. And we have laws in place in some contexts, the one you're probably most familiar with, although I hope not personally, would be bankruptcy, where we've actually decided as a society certain pieces of information we are going to actively choose to forget. Right? So you went bankrupt 10 years ago. We're not going to use that information to make decisions about you anymore. Those policies become really, really difficult to enforce as that information becomes available through different channels and through different entities. And today I think we have so much information that's going out the door that people are actively choosing to disclose about themselves, that this whole understanding of kind of social forgetfulness, a very American concept of the right to kind of start with a clean life, move west, young man, becomes very, very complicated. And the understanding of social forgetfulness and how we might build that into systems, I think is an interesting challenge, and one that I think is probably important for the generation that I currently have over at the university. I'm going to close there.